Hey everyone, welcome to lesson 1 of week 2, where we're going to start getting into philosophy proper, starting with ethics. Now, as I've alluded, ethics is, well, obviously the most important branch of philosophy, not just because I study it. No, but ethics is important because it is especially practical. Many of you in your intro discussions were asking me, is this a class where we're going to be able to learn um, practical applications of philosophy? How is philosophy going to impact my day to day or the way I really think? And I think that's some parts of philosophy are not that, though they are important. But ethics does not suffer from that problem. Ethics is incredibly practical. Um, and let me break that down a little bit. So ethics is the branch of philosophy, as you know from last week, that deals with right and wrong, good and bad. And because it studies that, though your mileage may vary, it's one of the most important things you could possibly study. Right? The study of ethics, or to study ethics, is the same as saying you're studying how you should live your life, who you should vote for, what you should study, how to live well. I think this is really exciting because ethics promises tools, methodologies, and resources to figure out how to answer these questions. But the scope of ethics is also somewhat daunting, right? Different from most other things that you can study in college. What I'm about to teach you in ethics is something that never fails to apply. Us as human beings, we are fundamentally ethical creatures. We are kinds of creatures that things can go better and worse for, and therefore we care about ethics because we want things to go better for us, right? But what does that mean? That's why it's important to study ethics. Now, this is also tells you why I thought it was important to start off with epistemic humility. Every person who I graded, I think there was some excellent questions that were asked and raised about epistemic humility, but no one disagreed flat out that epistemic humility was a bad thing, or that we shouldn't try to use it in our day to day lives. And I think this module, hopefully, actually, it's going to test if you really meant that when you wrote your discussion post, because ethics, people really care about it, right? Again, this is fundamental questions on how you live your life every single day, and if we are to approach this with epistemic humility, it's really different. It's really difficult, right? It's one thing to say that we want to be epistemically humble and to admit when we're wrong and to be open to learning from others, until they start to tell us how we should live our lives, right? Or until their political and ethical and moral views differ from ours, right? So this is going to put it to the test. And if you find yourself, kind of having maybe you feel some of those cognitive biases coming into play, or you kind of you feel these emotions flare up and you're not sure where they come from. That's okay, right? That tells you that you're human, that you are fundamentally an ethical being, but it's also a cue for you to put that epistemic humility to the test and see, is this really something that you're about or not? All right, so I urge you to take it seriously because the stakes are high in ethics, but that's why it's also so interesting, fun to learn, and fun to teach. All right, my goal for you is to come out the other side of this class not to have changed your mind, but to at least have thought about why you believe what you believe, especially when it comes to how you live your life, how you treat others, and how you go about assessing ethical scenarios. All right, that's enough preamble. Let's get into it. So the way I'm going to start to talk about ethics is with the trolley problem. Let me scooch over here. The trolley problem is a classic thought experiment in ethics, right? If you hear thought experiment, that's something that we like to say in philosophy whenever we have a toy example, right? A toy example is a simplification of how the real world works in order to apply our theories and see how it kind of works in the lab, right? So those scientists who are joining us are probably, like, whatever, thought experiments, okay, philosophers. But these are important because they cue us into a very important data when we're looking into ethics, and that is our ethical intuitions. Now, ethical intuition is a faculty that everyone, maybe with the exception of psychopaths, have. We can look at the world and we feel some way about it, right? And the way we feel turns out to be something quite important, especially once we start to inform our intuitions with principles, concepts like good and bad, right and wrong, evil and good, right? We start to view the world through this lens of these ideas, and subconsciously we pick up on salient features of ethical problems, right? Even if we're not sure how to put that into words all the time, usually we feel when something is, yeah, that seems right, or no, something seems wrong here, right? One way to point this out, I'll throw out a thought experiment right here. Say you saw some kids and they are harassing this cat, right? They're swinging it by its tail, maybe they're kicking it around, right? Probably even as I say that, there's some part of you that's kind of internally cringing, right? That's an ethical intuition. You are having a subconscious kind of appraisal of that situation as something's wrong here, right? And so that's what the trolley problem is designed to do. It's supposed to, again, test those ethical intuitions to see maybe what's going on with our intuitions. Okay, so let's take a look at the classic trolley problem first. Now, I believe this was a thought experiment developed by the renowned philosopher Philippa Foot. She's awesome. She writes, she's very prolific in ethical discourse, and I believe this is one of her thought experiments. All right, so here's how the experiment is set up. We have a trolley, right, a train, headed down the tracks here, and it's going to hit these 5 people. Okay, so this is its default direction. This is you, the poor soul at the switch, who has an ability to change the outcome of what's about to happen, right? Now, the point of this thought experiment is not necessarily to be realistic, right? It's to, just like science, constrain the amount of variables so that we can test something very specific, right? Many times when I teach this, students are extremely creative in how they would approach the problem solving, and that is a good thing, right? We want people to be creative, innovative problem solvers when it comes to ethics. We want them to see the nuance, right, as kind of we discussed in our week 1. This example is designed to destroy that nuance. We get at something very specific so that we can figure out what the right thing to do is, and then we can go from that simple example to something more complex, okay? So, in this example, the brakes are broken, it is flying down this track. The only thing that you can do is flip the switch to change it from going and hitting these 5 people to hitting this one person, okay? What is the right thing to do? What is your ethical intuition telling you is the right thing here, okay? Well, one thought here that I often find when I'm teaching this, right, is people say, flip the switch, right? It's better that one person dies rather than 5, right? It seems like there is at least 5 times the value of one life, right? If one life is valuable, then certainly 5 must be more so, right? So, kind of just simple math, right? It seems maybe a little bit callous even, right? And perhaps it is, but wouldn't you hope that someone would act this way if it wasn't you who was at the switch, right? Isn't it far more likely that if you were one of these people, you'd be amongst the 5 rather than the 1? So maybe we can, our ethical intuition from this is that we want people to make decisions that benefit the greater good, or the majority, right? We might develop this intuition into something like a principle. A principle isn't just a feeling, right? It is a statement, a premise in a moral argument that asserts what the right thing to do is. So a principle here might be, the right thing to do is to save the most lives possible, okay? And hey, now we have a principle, now we're doing ethics, okay? We've moved on from the spark of ethics, which is ethical intuition, to now we are dealing with premises and principles. Great, save the most lives. What could possibly be objectionable about that, right? Well, let's change up the example and see if our principle stands. Okay, so now these go from, faceless strangers to now imagine you have someone who's important to you. Your mom, your brother, a daughter. Someone who you love and you care about is the one here, right? Say it's you here. Say this is, someone else making the decision. Would you still endorse that principle that we just came up with? Do you still think it's the right thing to do to save the most amount of lives? I think that's a harder question, right? It's a little bit easier to do the moral calculus when we don't know who it is. Okay. You could also, make this even more difficult. Let's say, again, this is someone you love, you care about, someone in your family, a close friend, and say this is the rest of your family. Okay. Are we back now to the right thing to do is to save the most lives possible? I don't know, right? My ethical intuition certainly has shifted, and yours might not, and that's okay, right? Because that's telling you something about the way you view the world morally. All right. So another intuition that we might be able to articulate into a principle here might be something like, how I know this person is important to me. I might say something like, who this person is important, right? Say this is, who's a genuinely good person these days? I don't know. Say this is the good version of Jeff Bezos, right? He's got all these billions of dollars, and he's promised that next week he's going to donate it to make all of our lives better, right? He's going to end poverty and so forth, right? Say that's the one person here, and these 5 people are 5 strangers, right? Does the value that this person stands to provide in the world change our ethical intuition here? And should it? Right? That's important. Maybe we shouldn't be being affected by how we feel about the person on the tracks. Okay? And right now, I'm just trying to articulate some of those ethical intuitions that you might be having right now, so you can start to see what that looks like, right? And because I'm going to be asking you to apply your ethical intuition to a more complex case once we look at these thought experiments. Okay. So you've got those ethical intuitions. Write them down. How do you feel? Maybe a little bit on why you feel that way. That's important. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. Okay. Our example here is slightly changed. There's still a runaway trolley barreling down the tracks with no way to stop it. There are 5 people on the track. You are up here on a pedestrian bridge over the tracks, and looking on with you, horrified, is a very large person, right? Now, in this example, we're led to believe that we can push this person off the bridge, they will fall in front of the trolley, and it will save the 5 people. What does your intuition tell you about this example? There seems, at least to me, something different about implicating someone who is innocent, who was not expecting, or who was not in danger, and suddenly implicating them in this deadly scenario, right? Differently than our first example where these people were both in danger, this person was not in danger. He took the pedestrian bridge, right? He's not stepping on the tracks. I don't know. What do you think here? There's also a possibility, and I think a likely possibility, that this example is somewhat fat-phobic, right? This is another one of those cognitive biases that we have, certainly in many in our society right now, right, where we tend to undervalue fat people, right? And this is an implicit bias or an explicit bias that some people have. And so, do we think that it's okay to sacrifice someone in order to save the 5, right? What I'll point out here is that the math is the same, right? It is 1 for 5. Our principle, right, if we had a principle like the right thing to do is to save the most lives, then we should be all for pushing someone over the edge and saving the 5. But if you feel differently, try to think about why that is, all right? Let's look at one more example. This is you. You're a doctor in a wing of a hospital. You have 5 patients in your hospital wing, all of whom are dying from organ failure. They have not been able to make the transplant list, and if they do not receive a compatible organ donation soon, they will all die. Now, out here in the waiting room, we've determined that somehow one person in that waiting room is a compatible donor for every one of the 5 people there. We could take them from the waiting room, we could sacrifice and harvest their organs from them, and we could save each of the 5 people in this waiting room. But again, my intuitions are certainly being pumped here, right? Something seems pretty wrong about that. We're sacrificing one to save the 5. Again, the math has not changed, but maybe our intuitions have. Why might that be? We might appeal, again, other intuitions now articulated as principles. We might appeal to something like consent, the freedom to choose, right? We might we might appeal to something about liberty, right? We might appeal to something about society. I don't want to live in a society where I could walk into any waiting room, because I just brought my loved one there and suddenly I'm being, my organs are being harvested to save 5 people. I mean, even though it's a good cause, I was using those organs, right? So why are our intuitions different here? Hopefully we have started to look at some of these situations, and though the math has stayed the same, right, our intuitions might be different, and that cues us in to the idea that there is more salient ethical features of these situations than maybe would be suggested by something like the original trolley car problem. All right? So, again, the purpose is to test the intuitions. Where these intuitions comes from is somewhat mysterious, but we'll worry about that later. And that's okay, because our intuitions are not the end of ethics, it's the start. These are a useful starting point, a singular data point that we can test against, right? If someone told us differently, if someone told us unquestionably the right thing to do here is to have the trolley car run over the 5, we would have something to say to them, right? We might not know why, but that something in us tells us there's ethics going on here, and we have a reason to engage with them, okay? Let's see. Where am I here? Okay, so hopefully this also starts to demonstrate that ethics is not just a matter of having an opinion, right? One person could say, I think it's, the right thing to do is to switch the track, save the one, or to kill the one at the expense of the 5, and someone could say something else, right? And if it's just these two opinions going up against each other, then who's to say which one is right? That's not really what ethics is. Just like elsewhere in philosophy, it's about an argument. We can debate what consent means, or what freedom ought to look like in a society. We can debate about when these values and concepts apply and when they don't, right? Some ethical opinions are better than others, and that's because they have an argument to back it up. Okay. Sorry, I've got someone yelling outside of my door. Okay, so again, once we move from intuitions to principles, we have a reason to think one way versus the other in these ethical cases. But as I mentioned at the beginning, real life ethics is much more complicated than these toy examples. These are very useful for telling us and starting to identify our intuitions, and also, as you'll see later, to test our moral theories. Let's take a look at what a real ethics case looks like. All right. So the case that I've selected is Case 5 from the 2024-2025 National Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl. Right. This is a competition somewhat like debate, where students get a set of something like 15 cases, and they're asked to debate them, to discuss them, and to ultimately decide on what the right thing to do is. So that we also do have an ethics bowl team at HCC, so if this is something that you're interested in, I'd highly recommend getting involved with it. But what's valuable about these cases is that they, in a short style, help to give us a very nuanced and modern ethical problem. So I'm going to go ahead and read this one, and I might say a few more things afterwards about how we might start to investigate it, how we might start to articulate our intuitions about it. And this is actually what you're going to respond to for discussion, or for the discussion this week. I want you to tell me based on your ethical intuition, what would you, how would you answer the question being posed by this case? Okay, so case 5 is life in the parking lot. This past March, the city of Sedona, Arizona, opened a 40-space safe parking lot to provide homeless residents a secure place to park and sleep without fear of harassment or being forced to move. This initiative allows them to rest more comfortably while working towards stability. To qualify for this program, participants must be fully employed within the city and actively engage with local social services. The Sedona City Council voted 6-1 to approve the lot, which is supported by a 2-year grant from the Arizona Department of Housing. While the program is intended as a temporary solution, operating for just 2 years as the city seeks more permanent answers to the housing crisis, it has sparked controversy. Many residents expressed concerns that the lot could attract crime or pollution. Sedona, like many communities, faces challenges in providing housing even for fully employed residents, exacerbated by the rise of short-term rentals like Airbnb and, is that VRBO or Verbo? I think they pronounce it Verbo, right? Similar situations have led to housing shortages in places like Flagstaff, Arizona, and elsewhere. While safe parking lots offer a temporary fix, some residents argue that addressing the root cause, such as proliferation of short-term rentals, might be a more substantial solution. The practice of living in cars is not uncommon in the United States, particularly in states like California that lack a legal obligation to shelter the homeless. In Los Angeles, even full-time students with multiple jobs sometimes find themselves living out of their vehicles. Los Angeles resident Brian Raymond shared his experience. Is your coworker sleeping in their car? You may never know. I had 3 jobs while living out of my car, good jobs too, serving $100 steaks and $1,000 bottles of Cabernet. No one ever knew. Following the vote, the Supreme Court ruled that bans on sleeping outside do not qualify as cruel and unusual punishments, and thereby are not in conflict with the 8th Amendment. In states like California, homelessness is caused in greater part by lack of affordable housing. Homelessness is caused in greater part by lack of affordable housing than drug abuse and mental illness. Following the ruling, many cities have begun clearing homeless encampments. In some states, like California, there are measures to provide temporary housing or safe spaces to the homeless, but these are not universally adopted nor required according to the new precedent set by the Supreme Court. Sedona's safe parking lot appears to be a viable option to help move the homeless to a safer area without destroying what many would consider to be their home. This raises the question, is a safe parking lot an effective and ethical way to address homelessness? While one Sedona resident argues, there's nothing compassionate about helping someone live in their car. For many with no other options, a car may be preferable to facing the elements. Then below the case here, we have our various sources that the case author used to construct this case. Okay, so hopefully 2 things were obvious to you as you were reading this, right? One is that this is a lot more complicated than the trolley car problems that we've been looking at, right? It's real life, and so there are so many variables here that we might look at, so many different principles or intuitions that we might appeal to. Second, I hope that this did spark some of those ethical intuitions for you, that you had an opinion about this case, that you have an opinion on this question specifically, that is a safe parking lot an effective and ethical way to address homelessness, right? Maybe you found yourself agreeing with some of these residents, maybe you found yourself disagreeing with some of them, maybe you learned something too, all right? So what I'd like you to do for your discussion post, or at least the part 1 of this discussion post, is to look at this problem pre-theoretically, right? That means I want you to approach it and articulate your conclusion and why you would defend that conclusion before I've taught you any ethical theories, right? These ethical theories are going to have their own tools and resources to help us answer problems like these, but it's important that you're in tune with what that ethical intuition is, and it's a great point of reference. So hopefully later on in the course or later in your life, you can look back on what your pre-theoretical ethical reasoning looked like, and you can see, hey, I was really onto something back then, and or I had no idea what I was talking about, right? Both are okay, right? This is the point of doing this in a class is we look at cases, we look at thought experiments, and we look at examples like this so that we can discuss them together. How should we break these things down? And hopefully we can hear some really interesting opinions and their reasons for holding those opinions from our classmates. Okay. I don't think I've allocated a ton of space for discussion post 1. You're of course welcome to write as much as you want, and I'll give you feedback on that, but please do try to articulate yourself as best you can in that first discussion post, and when we return in lesson 2, we're going to break this down using a moral theory and see what that looks like. Alright, let me know if you have any questions. I hope you found this interesting as I do.